Welcome to another informal discussion on building a more inclusive digital and analog world, where we'll learn about what's on the minds of experienced practitioners in the tech for social impact space. Today I'm speaking with Lukas Borkowski. Lukas is a digital for development strategist, and he designs impact-focused digital approaches for international development programs with donors like GIZ, DFID, and the European Union. He is a director of European partnerships at Viamo, a global mobile engagement partner, where he is also leading the work on digital strategy advice. Although today I want to stress that he's here in his personal capacity. So Lukas, let's get started. What's one big thing on your mind right now that you think we need to be paying more attention to?
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for the invite and the opportunity. I guess over the last couple of weeks and months, a lot of people in the digital for development space have been working quite intensively on COVID-19 response. And at Viamo, we've been working a lot on communication experiences and communication design programs, connect people with information. And I've been personally thinking a lot about these programs that are being designed and developed, and I think it's heartening to see how much money is going into that space right now, and it's much needed. But on the other hand, there are also really strong compromises being made on the data privacy front. And I guess when it comes to COVID-19, a lot of people are speaking about contact tracing, about things like self-diagnosis and other elements. And while that is all really powerful and technology can play a big role here, we're also speaking about data that is very sensitive, and particularly, even in countries like the US or over here in Europe, we wouldn't want our governments to get hold of that data necessarily without our consent. Now think about a context in a country where you have even less democratized government, and yet you cultivate data in those countries and bring that together with data localization laws, and you create the recipe for a really powerful tracing setup, not only for Corona, but also for a lot of other purposes that might not be as beneficial to the general population as contact tracing in times of COVID-19.
Yeah, and so I think for some people who are watching who might not be familiar with data localization laws, just to clarify there, and those are laws that require data to be stored on servers within a specific country. And normally there's different requirements for different types of data depending on the country. And so are there, when we're looking at that, and you have countries where data localization laws may exist, where there's a lot of potential benefit from knowing how people are moving, where they are, where they're staying. Do you have any thoughts on what's the right way to balance that of, there's this, if we just look at right now, you have this sort of public health emergency need, which is short term, but then you have longer term potential implications on people's liberties and rights and what have you.
Yeah, I guess, and to be fair, here in the beginning, to start with, I think data localization is great, because if we speak about artificial intelligence for good, it's also about this colonization of data, and there are a lot of good arguments being made for data localization on the African continent, on the Asian continent. So that's not the dam in itself, and I guess a pretty good standard is also being set by data regulations like GDPR and others that have really clear-cut examples and best practices, I'd say. Not sure if it's best practice, but the highest standard that we know so far for consent, but also for the right to be forgotten, and other elements, or auto deletion of data. And I think that's all very much needed. The difficulty is, though, that in a lot of countries in the context of international development in particular, the regulatory authorities are so under-resourced and understaffed that in most instances, they're not even in a capacity to track data localization. So I think that's, to start with, there needs to be an effort to boost these data regularization authorities and regulators, maybe on a regional approach. I'm not saying that's a great thing if every and each country would have their own standards. That would also certainly make it complicated. But on the other hand, I think there's also a strong need for some sort of sensitivity in the international development space to consider data localization a must, but then also think of the downside and the upside at the same point. So the upside is, of course, you're nourishing an AI for good environment, and in times of COVID-19, we see that a lot of really promising tech startups and tech companies are coming up from countries that are most affected in the international development space. So a lot of really promising and brilliant ideas coming out of Western Africa right now, or Southern Africa. And they need the data, of course. I mean, the engines cannot be trained without data, and aggregated data might not be as good. I think we all know that. But on the other hand, there's a lot of data being cultivated and locally stored without even the consent of the users. I mean, again, that's happening in the US, that's happening in Europe, but also a lot more probably in other places of the world. And what really worries me is that a lot of international development partners and donors, funders and implementers and NGOs right now contribute to that tendency without necessarily realizing A, that they're doing it, and B, what the long-term effect of that could be. And I think international development plays a key role here to build the data regulation environment, but also to be a role model for pushing forward, or at least implementing the best standards right now, not from a legal standpoint. And that's what I'm seeing in practice right now. There's a lot of discussions, in my role at Viamo, a lot of discussions about GDPR, for example. Everyone is rightfully so cautious, but I think legal compliance is one element. Me personally, I would say it's also about an ethical consideration. We have the do not harm approach in international development for decades now, I'd say, but that's not necessarily being applied to data. Yeah. And I think that's probably where we would need to start, with a do not harm for data, and then second element, to boost the capacity of data regulation authorities in those countries. And yeah, I guess that's probably a first immediate recipe, I'd say. And there are great initiatives out there, right? A lot of donors, a lot of organizations are doing great things. I know of people and programs at GIZ, for example, that are working with it, so the German Development Corporation. I guess a lot of European donors are really sensitive for data privacy and data regulation because of GDPR and the discussions that led to it. Mm-hmm. But I also know that certainly USAID and others are working on it. But I guess there needs to be a consensus that this is growing into a problem.
And you make a really great point in that this is not something that's unique to the international development humanitarian sectors. Like I was just reading this morning, one of the largest mobile network operators in Thailand, a whole bunch of their data was discovered, of user data and what their browsing patterns have been, was discovered online in a non-password protected database. Right. So this is something that is happening across the board, but particularly, I think that we've probably both seen this in the international development sector, particularly when there's times of urgency. I think those issues of data privacy and security sometimes become secondary. And I think you make a great point that, this sector really should be pushing the envelope in terms of leadership when it comes to advocating and demonstrating best practices when it comes to thinking about people's data privacy, people's data security, and also the longer term implications of decisions that are made that are linked to people's data.
Yeah, and let's think that through. I mean, naturally, working with Viamo, I'm a big fan of mobile network operators and the data that's coming out of that. And I think organizations like Viamo and others have shown great results in working with that data or using that technology. But now at the advent of voice print or voice recognition in local languages that is being pushed by, you know, notable initiatives from the Mozilla Foundation, for example, others to make that technology accessible for people that cannot read and write. At the advent of this environment, we also need to think about where this can lead to. So on the one hand, you know, helping illiterate smallholder farmers in rural Madagascar to navigate weather news on their simple mobile phone, potentially even for free, with their own voice by just saying, I want to know if it rains tomorrow, is great. I think we can all agree on that. But on the other hand, if you think through a scenario where you would enable voice print, which could, you know, again, voice print for people that might not know, voice print is basically you record your voice, and based on the sinus curves and other elements in the audio recording itself, it can be matched to almost 100% security to only you.
And some people, just for viewers who might be watching from the US or Europe, you know, they may be familiar with this through banks. Some banks are pushing this now as a way of, you know, validation.
Yeah, and given that banks in Europe or the US are already using it, shows it is secure, because I guess otherwise they wouldn't necessarily use that. So in the context of international development, a problem and mobile for development, a problem we always have is phone sharing, right? So people use several phones, and several phones, each phone can be used by several people. In other words, if you have a phone number, it's not a unique identifier. Which makes it really difficult to track the impact of certain activities. And we have workarounds and all of that, but these are just workarounds. So with an element like voice print, there are great use cases in terms of monitoring evaluation. There's a great use case in terms of public service delivery. All right, people could call in and they could say, "Hi, I'm Lucas. I want to know more about how many taxes I have to pay tomorrow. Or next month," or similar thing. So there's great enthusiasm in the space for voice print.
Yeah.
Now, if you collect voice print, and sure, in an ideal scenario, it's all encrypted, it's all super safe and everything. But if you collect voice prints of populations, and let's say of everyone in a certain country, and an actor, an illicit actor, potentially even the government, or let's say an upcoming political movement, or in that sort, gets hold of that data, it would allow them to basically trace people, no matter where they are, and even people that are not identified. And we all know voice and language is linked also to ethnicity. So that's also a great blueprint for potentially great damage that can be done with technology. And again, based on novel interests and novel initiatives that are being set up right now. And I think that is why we need really strong data regulation authorities, but also best practices, blueprints, and as you said, Josh, really pushing for that in international development. I guess what I witness right now is a big push for this new technology, and I'm a big fan of it. And indeed, I'm passionate for voice print and also voice recognition. There are a lot of great initiatives ongoing, but in a sandbox, I'd say that is not a sandbox, but real life, and where there are little rules existing right now, and not really a referee that's making sure that these rules are being obeyed. And that is potentially growing into a gigantic problem, and a problem that cannot be reversed. You know, that's not just you know, delete and start over. But with every data point we're collecting, we are potentially at the moment exposing someone in the future to an enormous risk.
Yeah.
And that's something that I guess coming back to COVID-19, a lot of people are fighting immediate risk right now, without necessarily looking at the longer term risk that they're creating. And that is, I'm not saying COVID-19 and all those communication campaigns should be stopped in response to COVID-19, but I'm saying we need to, and there's urgency and sometimes that's a trade-off, but we need to at least build into the systems that all the data that's collected is, if needed, deleted in the near future so that we're not creating harm.
Yeah. Well, we like to keep these short and sweet, Lucas. So I want to wrap it up with one last question, which is, given all of this, what are one or two takeaways that you think people should really be focusing their attention and action on now and moving forward?
I think really giving the do not harm approach a second thought and the future in the space of digital for development, and also extending it not only to elements like where it has been proven its success, sectors or spaces like gender or marginalized populations, but also to anything that's digital, and thinking about a digital do not harm approach. And that's not just, designing with the user is not enough. That is not necessarily enough to prevent harm, but it's actually going beyond that, and sometimes even against the interest of the user. Data protection, I'd say, and data privacy should also be superior to user experience. So in other words, if a certain service cannot be made safe and great at the same time, well, then rather make it safe and great.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it will be great, but really bad in the future. So I think that is, data privacy should be the ruling paradigm in digital for development, regardless of what technology, regardless of what delivery channel.
Yeah, fantastic. This is really great food for thought here, Lucas. And I want to thank you for sharing this with us here today. To anyone watching, I'd encourage you to share any thoughts or reactions you have in the comments. And of course, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can receive updates on future episodes. Thanks, Lucas, and thanks again to everyone watching.
Josh.